I majored in medieval and Renaissance history in college, which for many of you would disqualify me from having anything to say on this subject. But that tells me one thing: you need a little bit of history to understand the future. So in looking at 2030, one measure might be, what have we done in 12 months? Just 12 months. And it begins and ends with data. It doesn't begin and end with debate, as much fun as it is to debate. It's just good data. So I'm going to just rattle through some things that have happened in the last 12 months, mainly data, and it's going to point towards where we'll be 2 years, 5 years, and even 9 years from now, and I'll have some thoughts on that. 10 states, that's 20% of the country, 10 states now are active in policy about veterinary telemedicine. A year ago, there was one state. That's not bad. And Florida clearly right now is the most intense state. There have been no complaints filed with veterinary medical boards in Ontario, Canada, 2.5 years into telemedicine, the FDA, which waived the restriction on the VCPR during COVID, or the 17 states that in some manner suspended enforcement of the VCPR rule concerning telemedicine during COVID. That means in all those jurisdictions, there's not been a single complaint filed with the veterinary board saying that a pet has been harmed, injured due to someone's use of telemedicine. So what's that mean for 2030? It's 9 years from now. All the fears you hear, all the speculation you hear regarding what's wrong with telemedicine, the bad things that can happen, and that's still part of the common parlance. Those fears now, based on the data, would appear to be unfounded. I think in 2030, we'll look back and wonder why it took us so long to understand that. What else we learned? Human healthcare, alongside veterinary medicine, ramped up telemedicine in 2020, and there's a lot to learn from that. And the data is fascinating from Accenture, one of the world's 3 or 4 largest consulting groups, did a study. It came out in July. They studied 6 countries. The US was part of it. They had 2,700 patients, cardiology, immunology, or oncology. 60% who used telemedicine for their treatment in this time period plan to continue with it. 90%, almost 100%, 90% said the quality of care with virtual care, telemedicine, was as good as inpatient or in-clinic care prior to the COVID epidemic. We've seen major dollars move into human medicine, recently an $18 billion teledoc transaction, and that's a key predictor for the future. The old, I think it was Jerry Maguire movie, follow the money. But the truth is, where you see investors go reflects what? It reflects legions of analysts and legions of people crunching data and watching trends, realizing this makes sense. This is a good place to invest. We have data from Ontario, Canada, Toronto's province, 15 million people, so a major province. We got that data in August 2020 after 2 years of medicine. What did we learn? 86% of vets during the COVID period in Ontario used telemedicine for non-urgent or chronic care. 68% of veterinarians, a large group, use it to triage new cases. After the government opened the doors and says you can have in-clinic visits, 81% of Ontario veterinarians continue to use telemedicine. And you can assume that 81% weren't convinced of it 2 years before that, or maybe even a month or a year before that. And 75% of the pet issues that the owners brought to the attention of the veterinarians through telemedicine in Ontario were resolved. Now, VVCA, the Veterinary Virtual Care Association, which we started a group of us almost a full year ago, we're going to bring you some significant data, and I hope you'll mark your calendars. This is the promotional part of the evening, which is the sponsor's privilege, right? On April 29th, which is our first anniversary, we're going to produce the Great British Data Show. Yes, it's a shameless knockoff on the Great British Baking Show, but it will provide data from Great Britain or United Kingdom, who have been ahead of the curve of the US on the use of telemedicine, including with respect to telemedicine prescriptions. Data that hasn't been shared publicly, it's going to be open to anyone that can access the website. We'll give you lots of information in the next few weeks. And you're going to want to pay attention to that because it covers a wide range of issues. We're also in May going to bring in data from the U.S. Docs, who's a sponsor, and Deb Leon's one of our founders, and I hope watching tonight. And they're going to share data from 90,000 patient encounters in 2020 in the States. And our whole theory is, let's not debate telemedicine, let's understand it, let's study the data and see what it tells us. Now, let me give you a sneak peek at some of the UK data. It was a survey by a group called u.gov in the UK. It's a private group, but the government uses u.gov all the time to regularly survey British citizens about issues. I'm sure they've been diving into the Harry and Meghan interviews the last few weeks, but they surveyed 1,840 pet owners. That's a good size sample, right? Regarding their experience with medicine in the past roughly 8 months. First thing we learned, which shouldn't surprise the professionals in the audience, 3 areas of usage concerning the pet dominated all telemedicine encounters: skin issues or derm issues, gastrointestinal, and lameness. And those 3 issues dwarfed other categories. Now, what's important about that is that I think that conforms to what most American vet techs, most American veterinarians and industry folks would expect. So it's not like people are using telemedicine for silly topics or ones that you couldn't possibly understand and have any help or guidance given during a digital encounter. So those are the categories. Now, of that audience, by the way, at first they made clear that 90%, so almost 100%, were, quote, highly satisfied with veterinary practices. So these aren't disgruntled pet owners that don't want to go to veterinarians in their practices. They're people that took advantage of an offering or a tool, if you will. 75% of the public, if you will, welcome the choice of virtual care or telemedicine. That's probably the #1 key to what things look like in 2030. We're really going to buck what the public wants. Ask yourself that. 74% said, very encouragingly, telemedicine or virtual care complements care inside of a veterinary clinic. They don't see it as opposed. They don't see it one or the other. They thought the two fit together, which is, I think, a view that many of us hold. 75%, unsurprisingly, valued the speed and the speed and the dollar value. Cost mattered to them, but in an era where you hear people having to wait 2, 3, 4 weeks to get a veterinary appointment in the States, some folks don't want to wait that long. And telemedicine is obviously one tool. The same has been true in human medicine, where you can get instant access or nearly instant access to a professional. And 87% of the public in the UK believe that this should be available for British citizens. Now, what's all this have to do with 2030? And I'll just pose 3 rhetorical questions, which is what a lawyer likes to do, but I think it's a good way to look at it. The first is, do any of you think that American veterinary medicine is going to spend the next 9 years saying no to what owners want? I'm going to say that again. If you consider the data I've just shared, and there'll be a lot more coming soon, do you think that American veterinary medicine is going to devote the next 9 years, nearly a decade, to repeatedly saying, we don't care if this is what pet owners want. We don't care if this is convenient for pet owners. We don't care if this is a tool that they need in their judgment to guide their pet's health and to make decisions, including going to clinics? Do we believe the scientifically trained veterinary community will simply ignore the data and say, we don't care what the data says? And I think that's a key issue here. I don't expect people to welcome change before they understand it. That's unrealistic. So the questions about telemedicine make sense. The debate about it makes sense. But at some point, the data, the learning, the science bubbles up and you look at it and say, why don't we embrace it? And I think what we've learned in Ontario, particularly what we've in the UK and what we've learned in almost a third of the states, would point that way. Second question I'd pose is, access to care is on everybody's list as an issue. The shortage of veterinarians, the shortage of vet techs, of vet nurses, the rising demand, the increase in ownership, all of that has put tremendous pressure on practices. And if supply doesn't grow and demand grows, it makes it harder to get what you need, in this case, veterinary care. Do you think the veterinary community cannot see that virtual care or telemedicine is vital for access to care? Do we really think for 9 years we're not going to make that connection and see that that's another way for people to get help and advice and guidance that they need, and we're just going to try to shut it down? I don't think so. Some may say so, but I'd take an easy bet on that one. And before I hand it off to my good friend Audrey Weisrick's panel, and she'll do a great job tonight, and I'm so glad she joined us, I'm going to pose the ultimate question, and I'd like everyone, wherever you are on the telemedicine virtual care spectrum, to think about this. I'll just take a fictional doctor. I'll call her Dr. X. If Dr. X is a good veterinarian on Monday and has been a good veterinarian for 5 to 8 to 10 years, does she turn into a bad veterinarian on Tuesday when she starts using telemedicine? All the fears, all the speculation, all sort of dangers posted out there have a single premise: that a good veterinarian who cares about pets, makes good judgment, uses science, uses medicine knowledge, focuses on what's best for the pet, that somehow that goes out the door and telemedicine turns that person into a negligent, incompetent, or a dangerous practitioner. And I've got to use these words because that's the premise of the argument. And something tells me that between Tuesday and Wednesday, going from an in-person conversation to a digital conversation, including with her staff, doesn't change the nature, the ethics, the seriousness with which that person takes her job. And I think that dynamic is going to make it not even 2030 before we embrace telemedicine fully. And it took human medicine 25 years because no one had ever thought about it. We have the benefit of the learning and experience we each have as patients. My annual physical last year at the Mayo Clinic was by telemedicine. It was fascinating. It was useful. It was what I would have expected. And I think that learning we get to deploy to shortcut the ramp up. It's not finished by now, shouldn't be expected to be, but I think it'll be well short of 2030 when we view telemedicine not as a godsend, not as a savior of anything, simply as a really good tool that fits the lifestyle, the technology, the knowledge, the artificial intelligence, all the things that go into making good decisions about our lives, particularly our healthcare. And I think we'll be in great shape.